Hey everyone, David here. Just wanted to give a quick plug to our friend Destiny, or Kaiju Hime, and the Kickstarter that she and a bunch of friends have started. It's called Girls Who Love Monsters. Girls Who Love Monsters is a 200-plus page full-color anthology filled with illustrations, comics, and prose about monsters and those who love them. This anthology is a platform for all those who identify as women to have their voices heard in the monster fandom. We are behind what Destiny and everyone else is trying to do, so we wanted to give them a shout out. And if you want to check out the Kickstarter or even support them, which we highly encourage you to do if you can, we did create a custom URL. It's a little easier than the Kickstarter URL. It's just bit.ly, so bit.ly /girls 4 monsters. Again, that's bit.ly /girls 4 monsters. Thanks for checking that out, and hope you enjoy the episode.
Previously on the Kaiju Apostle podcast.
Yeah, our show is nothing except a source of constant anxiety and fear for our guests.
I've been a Godzilla fan since, shortly after mastering potty training.
That doesn't tell us how long it's been. Space women were a problem.
I mean, it wasn't a problem to me.
So the Toho lawyers who were listening about you adapting their stuff they've picked their pens back up and they're furiously scribbling notes now. Moist Minya and everything.
I have 8 lovely patrons right now, and I'm getting very close
How
to
many
the point.
ugly ones?
What was that about Moist Minya? Oh, man.
So welcome back to the Kaiju Apostle podcast, a show where two seminarians discuss and read way too much into giant monster films. I'm David.
I'm Chris.
And joining us is Ben, and I actually did not ask how to pronounce your last name before we started, so I'm going to sound like a jerk.
It's just Wahrman.
Okay.
It's got an H in there because my family is from the Eastern Europe, Austria-Hungary, Germany area. So they snuck an extra consonant in there that doesn't need to be there. But it's just Wahrman. So
an extra continent. We're Asian men. No, but thank you so much for joining us, Ben. So this is the first guest that we've had on that Chris knew before the show. So you guys kind of have that connection there. So if you wouldn't mind just sharing a little bit about yourself, maybe some dirty laundry on Chris that we might be interested in knowing.
Chris and I met was mainly through just Twitter. I think I write for a Star Wars fan site called 1138.com, and Chris kind of interacted with me first on Twitter, mentioning that he really liked some of the stuff that I had written, and found out partway into our friendship that he lives pretty close to where I live. So we've actually met up a few times now in person, obviously in the before times, we've watched some cheesy old Star Wars stuff that may or may not have been bootlegged, just to kind of, just to experience. It's always more fun to experience stuff like that in a group than it is to watch it on your own.
Absolutely.
So we kind of, just hung out, had some good times, laughed about cheesy 80s Star Wars specials that very few people remember. We've kind of hung out, and you can ask him kind of yourself why he asked me to be on this podcast, but
Yeah, this was the kind of way of saying the first time we met was at a Chinese restaurant, and I feel like we're probably the only people who've ever talked about the Yuuzhan Vong ever in that restaurant.
Yes, that's true.
I feel like we probably will be. And when you say frequents 1138, you mean obsessively, compulsively reads everything. I think Coop once messaged me. He's like, "Hey, you're not reading these right when I post these, are you?" Because I'm retweeting them the second they go up. So.
Yeah, there are times I do miss being more active on Star Wars Twitter, because 1138 was one of my favorite sites to go to. I always loved managing to get under Coop's skin too. It was always fun because it takes a lot. So if you can do it, it's definitely, you feel very proud of yourself. So yeah, I mean, so you guys are very tight knit when it comes to not only your friendship but Star Wars as well. But when he told me that you were a Godzilla fan, I was definitely excited. So kind of tell us a little bit about, because a lot of people that we have on our show either have their own podcast, maybe they're an artist in the community. So what is your history with this franchise?
I was brought kind of into the Godzilla world, so to speak, through my dad, who he grew up watching the English versions of Godzilla films, the Showa era specifically, on like public access TV back in, I would have been like the 70s. Come on at like 3 p.m. after he got home from school. And he kind of passed that love of the franchise down to me. He would come home from work. Some days he would stop at like a Blockbuster and rent Godzilla VHS tapes, and we watched them after dinner. And I always kind of loved the franchise because it was something that number one, it was something that he had watched before. So he had pre-screened it. He knew that there wasn't anything too bad that was going to corrupt my young mind or anything like that at that age. But it was also something that they were fun. They were fun movies that didn't bore me as a kid, and that were, they were colorful, they were lively, they had a lot of fun characters in them. Obviously it was the English versions back then. But as time's gone on and I've kind of become more, well-rounded as a person, I guess I've gotten more into obviously like the production side. I want to hear more about the history of how these films were made, watching in the original Japanese versions instead of the English dubs, and just kind of digging a little bit deeper into the films, both from a textual standpoint as well as a metatextual standpoint, to see, okay, when were these films made? What's the context of these films? I'm not like a historian or anything like that. I don't have the credentials.
We aren't either.
I don't have the credentials of a lot of other people in the fandom. I don't have my own podcast like you mentioned, but I love these movies. I don't think, I was thinking about this yesterday. I don't think that there's a film like a Godzilla film made in Japan that I don't like, at least to some degree, which I don't know how rare that is in the fandom. I think that there's
we'll get
at
into
least
that
one
later.
I think there's at least one that most people don't like. But going back through, I did a rewatch of the whole Showa era recently, and I kind of posted at the time on Twitter about like what my opinions were on each film as I went. And I realized that a lot of the films that I hadn't liked when I was younger, I liked a lot more than I was older, and watching them in the Japanese version helped a lot as well, because a lot of the things that are problematic in the American versions aren't present in the Japanese versions, either the bad translations or the bad dub actors, things like that. So yeah, I mean, there's not a whole lot that I have to say about the films that I dislike. There are some that I obviously are higher on my list than others, but I like being a fan of a franchise that I can kind of go into without many reservations,
Unlike a certain other one.
I think it's funny that you mentioned, your dad would watch and screen things before you'd watch it, because I grew up watching this film, that we're going to be talking about tonight a lot as a kid. I never noticed the porn in the back of the truck, right? Never noticed it. And then as an adult, I'm like, okay, well, there's boobs. That's cool, I guess. Whatever. So you said that, you grew up with the dubs like almost all of us did. So what inspired you to take these films, I wouldn't say more seriously, but what inspired that change or that shift of perspective for you?
I think part of it was just like kind of wanting to experience them in their original form. Because I think what prompted it was I was reading at some point, I have no idea when, but I was reading about specifically the King Kong versus Godzilla, the original one. Obviously, the new one isn't out and probably never will be. Thank you, Chris. But the original version, because that was the one that I watched the most often was King Kong versus Godzilla. We owned that tape, and we would.
Did you have the box? It was the blue cover.
I don't remember.
That's the one that like I felt like almost everybody had. It was that kind of turquoise-ish blue. VHS slip. It was great.
It might be. It's honestly, it was one of those cases that I feel like probably got destroyed and we just had the tape, you know?
Yeah, we had a few of those.
But I grew up watching that film a lot. It was the one that it's to this day, it's probably the one that I've seen the most. But then I read an article about, I think it was like on a Godzilla fan site, that was about all of the edits that were made to that film to change it to the American version. And it's like, oh yeah, they cut this out, they cut this out. And oh yeah, the entire musical score was replaced. And I was like, wait, what? And I went back and watched it and I was like, what? Yeah. So the American version, the entire musical score was replaced and all of the music that's in there is lifted out of Universal monster movies. So if you've seen like Creature from the Black Lagoon, you'll recognize half of the score from that movie. And it's like, oh no, they just butchered this, didn't they? This movie that I loved growing up is actually just a hacked up like Frankenstein's monster of a film. And then I went and watched the Japanese version. I'm like, this movie, it's so much more coherent and better in Japanese than it is in the American version. And I mean, obviously not all of the films were hacked up like that in editing. Like I think even the one we're talking about today wasn't edited very much. It was mainly just dubbed and then just kind of localized. But you guys even said it earlier on in the run of the podcast, is that there's something inherently destructive about translation from one language into another. And I feel like something about like an American or English dub of, be it a Japanese film or another type of foreign film, inherently feels more destructive than a subtitled version, even if what's being spoken by the dub actors is the same as the subtitles. I think the performance and emotion of the dub actor never matches the original actor, the original performance. And I feel like even if you don't understand the language, you can still get the emotion of the scene from an actor. And so that's kind of what started me on that road, was watching the original Japanese of Godzilla versus King Kong and realizing how much more I liked it than the English version. And then going from there throughout the other films and just being like, you know, even the ones that previously I had disliked because of the bad localizations were actually good, or at least not as bad as I had remembered. And there were things about them that I actually enjoyed. So, you know, it kind of, it helped me to enjoy the franchise more because I kind of understood the difference of like what the localization may have done to the perception, to my own perception of the franchise, and kind of going back to the original, or at least as close to the original as I, as a white man who cannot speak Japanese, can get, helped me to kind of establish a better foundation for like, oh, these are what these films are actually meant to be.
Yeah. And I think something you said there is really important is, you know, when we talk about this idea of translation being violence, it's not inherently a bad thing, right? Mm-hmm. Because if it wasn't for these dubs, we wouldn't even be able to have these conversations, because the movies would have never come over to the States. You know, throughout the history of the franchise, it's been the Western fans that have helped keep the ball rolling. It's not, I mean, Toho is not indebted to us entirely, but there's definitely been that momentum, right? So I think something to be said is, you know, some of these dubs people have fond feelings towards, but they're not necessarily great. Right. I mean, you especially look at like contemporary dubbing standards, and like I watched the Shin Godzilla dub here about a year or two ago, and it actually wasn't too bad. I've done some of the Gamera dubs from the 90s. I mean, they're serviceable, right? It's definitely, you feel like there's more of a reverence for the source material compared to the 50s, 60s, and even 70s. Because back then, at least for Western viewers, there wasn't as positive of a reception towards these movies as we have now. And the movie we're discussing today is part of that. Which I guess we probably should say what movie we're discussing, right? I mean, it's in the title. But we are discussing Godzilla vs. Megalon, which was released on March 17th, 1973. So let's go ahead and we'll jump into the plot summary here. Ben, if you could go ahead and help us out with that.
All right. Oh, okay. Once upon a time in the land of Seatopia lived a peaceful race ruled by Emperor Antonio. They had sank to the bottom of the ocean deep and remained quite quiet, made nary a peep, until the humans above let off a big bomb, kaboom, that enraged the Cetopians, and they swore the Earth Dwellers' doom. Go, Megalon, they cried. Come help, Gigan, they pleaded, while our protagonists were, at the hands of Cetopian agents, defeated. But thankfully the robot, Jet Jaguar, came too, and flew off to Monster Island to find a kaiju, who'd be willing to help, and lo and behold, Godzilla came swimming to help shoulder the load. The movie ends with some top-notch monster action. That Godzilla tail slide, supreme satisfaction. But if history has something to tell, we must ask, has this movie's legacy aged well?
Thank you, Ben. Always just, it warms my heart. Like, I'm not trying to be like proud, but I'm like, this is the kind of stuff that I would love to write like a kid's book for Godzilla fans.
That new one, the King Kong and Godzilla Are Friends book.
Yeah. Yeah, I know that some people have been making fun of that, but I'm personally excited for that because I'm a dad. So whatever. All right. So staff for this movie. This is one of the last that Jun Fukuda will direct, which is a bummer. Written by Jun Fukuda and Shinichi Sekizawa, but there is a giant asterisk next to that. Tomoyuki Tanaka was producer. Surprise. Music, Richiro Manabe returns. Chris, do you remember what movie he did?
Man, I barely remember who did all of the Star Wars.
I know. What's the only Godzilla movie we've talked about so far that's had a really weird soundtrack? Like, incredibly weird.
Oh gosh, I remember the discussion. Oh no, people are adding me. People
Roman
are adding
porn.
me right now. Oh, that was like last week, wasn't it?
No, it was a couple episodes ago.
Okay.
It was a Hedera.
That's right. Gosh, I wasn't going to get there.
No, it's all good.
Everybody's blocking and unfollowing me right now.
Yeah, I mean, you put
The
your foot in
Roman
your mouth
porn
with the
really
Roman
is.
porn thing, and you can't even remember that.
Oh gosh.
I never thought I'd say that word so many times in 60 seconds. Okay. So, cinematography by Yuzuru Aizawa, and then special effects was Teruyoshi Nakano. So, trivia, didn't really have a whole lot that I got from this. Kind of went through Dave Klatt's book a little bit. Sorry, the sparkling seltzer water got me burping. Okay. But really, I think the thing that stood out to me the most was that when we're looking at the time of this movie being released, there was a huge shift in the focus to TV from movies, which we've discussed, but especially it's these, henshin heroes, right? The transforming shows like Ultraman. I mean, because by this point, and I kind of talk about this a little bit later, by this point we've had 5 Ultra shows, right? So we had Ultra Q, Ultraman, Ultra 7, we've had Return of Ultraman, and then it would be Ultraman Ace. So we've had, really, I don't know if I'd consider Ultra Q as influencing superheroes, but we've had 4 Ultraman shows to this point. There's other shows that are starting to come around. So that's where people are going, right? You don't have to do movie tickets. You just stay at home. You make your one-time investment in a TV and you watch your show every week. So Toho very naturally shifted towards that as well. With the asterisk I had mentioned before, so Danny had brought up in our last episode on Godzilla vs. Gigan that Shinichi Sekizawa and Takeshi Kimura had come together to write the plot they had all these different ideas. I think there was like Varan, there was that Yog monster, not Yog, I can't remember the name, and then like a Daimajin ripoff. So there's all these different ideas that didn't end up being used for Godzilla vs. Gigan, which was also Megalon. So because that idea wasn't used there, this is where we get this new movie. So technically, Takeshi Kimura is not a credited writer here, but this was part of his idea. And then lastly, we've never talked about this before, but this movie does definitely not pass the Bechdel test. There's no possible way for it to do so. Most Godzilla movies do not, but this is like the most glaring instance because all the women are just Cetopian dancers pretty much. So I thought that was a little interesting. I didn't think I never really noticed that before, right? Till I was watching, I was
Yeah.
like, oh my God, like there's no women in this film at all.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's this movie has a very small cast, like overall.
Very.
They had to make room for all the monsters.
Chris, if you could go ahead and do the
Yes.
poll for us.
I sure can. This is the insect wise one, right? 'Cause
Yes,
last week
I made sure to copy and
Okay.
paste the right one this time.
Whew. Well, last week when I was like, oh, this could have been different. Anyway, all right. So the question was, so far, insect wise, we've had a spider, Kamanga, a praying mantis, Kamacuras, moth, and then he left this blank, so I'm not sure whom we're talking about. And now we have a beetle with Megalon. So you're not allowed to spoil me on upcoming monsters. But what kind of bug did Toho leave on the table by not utilizing? So the fourth one, the one that you thought was the least scary, was the dung beetle, the poopsmith's favorite of all insects.
I thought that would be the worst. I mean, have you seen the balls of crap that they roll? If you get stuck in that,
Yeah.
you're done. There's no
Yes.
way of getting out.
I'm just guessing someone didn't want to dress in the dung-covered costume.
Yeah, probably.
Okay, this is where you are all wrong. So number 3 was mosquito, which is quite clearly the most scary of insects.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because like I imagine they're suckers, but like 11 stories tall.
Mm-hmm.
So the second one was pill bug or roly poly, and then finally the millipede, which probably scarier than a human centipede.
Speaking of dung
That's
beetles,
Speaking of dung, oh Lord, that would be a really hard. How many actors do you think you would need in a millipede kaiju monster costume?
I don't know.
That would almost have to be done like as a marionette.
Oh, maybe.
Yeah, hopefully it would look better than Manda did in Atragon, though. That one was a bit rough. He's just...
Oh, man.
So the Twitter discussion for this episode, with Godzilla vs. Megalon, we see a continuation in the Godzilla as superhero trajectory. Despite the lack of gravitas and the obvious Ultraman influences, does the movie work for you? Or should it sink to the depths alongside the Empire of Mu? I was actually surprised at the majority of positive replies we had to this movie. Not saying it's bad, but like, I mean, for as much as y'all hate All Monsters Attack, this was very surprising to see the positive spin here.
Just read them out, why don't you?
So we'll start with the Aqua Slug, which, if you remember him, it's referenced his article in the Space Amoeba episode. Fun movie with the heart and logic of a child. I wanted that triple dolphin big thing when I was a kid. And I absolutely agree. I was right there with you. Garudon, who runs the out of context movie or monster clips. I don't know if you've seen that Twitter account. It's good to see you around here. He said, I recognize it's a movie that forever tainted the view of Japanese Goji movies in the West, that they were all schlocky cheese fests about guys in suits, but I'd be lying if I didn't think it was an utter joy to watch. Still a favorite. Matt Metcalf said, if this movie doesn't work for you, you're dead inside.
That's harsh.
Well, I can't say I disagree. Trisha Dwyer Morgan wrote, I go with the school of thought that Godzilla fights for his survival and the Earth's. Sometimes that parallels human survival, but he isn't a superhero with ideals that include us. Instead, depending on the movie, he is either a titan or a wild animal doing what he must. Ken Bockelman wrote, awful movie. Megalon as a kaiju is cool looking, and that damn scene, being DAM, we are a family-friendly podcast, is well done, but that's it. The characters are lame. Godzilla looks like a high Muppet. More stock footage. Other than that, it's a masterpiece. Poop emoji. And lastly, we have Batagor Johnson, which I'm going to give a shout out. He had I'm drawing a blank now. What's the prospector guy from Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer? What's his name?
Yukon Cornelius.
There we go. Yeah, that's his profile picture, and I was like, man, yeah, that's a good one. That takes me back. I don't get how people can call Godzilla vs. Gigan a war crime and then rave about Megalon. I'm a fan of both, but truth be told, Megalon was the only Godzilla film to bore me as a kid. Too long to get to the showdown. And I do want to come back to that tweet there. So, Chris, let's go ahead and start with you. What were your thoughts?
Let me just frame this one as every time in the past I would use a Godzilla GIF and it was like him doing the tail slide or the dance moves. I always thought that that was like fan footage or something that someone on Twitter put together. So every time I see that in an actual movie, like I'm blown away. I'm kind of amazed. And it honestly it warms my heart a little bit more toward the movie. Like, if your movie doesn't have something campy in it, I probably am not going to like it as much. Unless, of course, it's Godzilla 98. Then I'll love it. But,
oh, there's plenty of camp. Don't worry, bud.
Oh, I mean, you got Matthew Broderick in there. Anyway, yeah, this one, this last comment about too long to get to the showdown, I did feel like I was kind of okay with that because you know that the monster fights don't always do a lot for me.
Mhm.
But I also don't know if it had quite the cast or the premise to warrant it going so long between or until the fight.
You didn't like Japanese Alan Rickman as the villain?
I was thinking that too, but I didn't want to I thought maybe I was crazy, but it's so true.
Oh, that's hilarious. But oh man, I couldn't, like, where I was watching this in 2020, I couldn't shake the Ultraman stuff. I couldn't.
Mm-hmm.
It was hard to totally like disengage from the real world on this one. So I liked it. It was fun. I can see why people might be hopping off, but I kind of like it going in this direction because we all know that I'm like, when it comes to Toku for me, I'm Sentai. So kind of when it moves closer to the superhero stuff, you're getting me back. So the stuff that people aren't liking about it, sounds like, from my limited perspective, is kind of what I'm digging the most right now. So
yeah. So two things I have to say. First, when you started that statement, it reminded me of Jimmy Fallon's impression of French Stewart on Celebrity SNL. And yeah, I had to say that, otherwise it'd eat at me all night.
Put it in the show notes.
Okay. But you're talking about, the Jet Jaguar and Ultraman influences. So I did not bring this up in the trivia, and I apologize. So I'm taking this offline off of the Hero Fandom wiki or whatever. So Jet Jaguar was the result of a contest Toho had in mid to late 1972 for fans to come up with a new hero for them to use, obviously to capitalize on all of the tokusatsu and anime, happening at the time, right? So the winner of the contest submitted the drawing of a robot called Red Aron. The robot resembled both Ultraman and Mazinger Z, I believe is how you pronounce it, which were both really popular at the time. The robot was renamed Jet Jaguar and was set to star in a film vehicle for him titled Jet Jaguar vs. Megalon, which pitted him against Megalon. However, Toho figured Jet Jaguar would not be enough to carry the film on his own, in-screen appearance, or marketing value, which was a big thing for them at the time. So during pre-production, even after doing some tests and storyboards, the project was shut down for several weeks until screenwriter Shinichi Sekizawa was called in to rewrite the script to add Godzilla and Gigan to have more marquee value. I obviously don't have necessarily sources for that, but that's pretty. I know the contest.
Have the wiki.
Well, yeah. I know the contest part was definitely true. As for it not being a Godzilla film, I don't remember if that's factual or not, but we're just going to run with it. And you can at me later. But yeah, it is hard to get away from the Ultraman vibes, especially with the Ultraman renaissance we're going through right now, which I'm drowning in currently. But
yeah, so we had talked the other night, kind of doing a little pre-planning for the episode, and I brought in Ultraman Z and the Z Riser. So I've decided which 3 metals you would need to rise into Jet Jaguar.
Okay.
And one of them's kind of a deep cut, so I'm really hoping one of you two gets this. So the 3 metals that you'd combine is Colossus's 90s costume with the red on the outside and the yellow on the inside. The second one is Ultraman, any. The third one is that moon guy that's at some McDonald's locations. You know, that President
Tonight?
Moon who's playing the piano. If you like combined all three of them, that's how you get evil Ultraman.
Oh man, you got to
So,
throw Joe Biden in there too, though.
oh my gosh. Yeah, we need to retweet that one in the show notes. Rob made just ultra disturbing, pun intended,
AC
picture.
Pelosi.
Yeah, oh my gosh.
Okay.
Ben, I'll DM you that picture because it was truly
it was really good. Ben, what about you? What were your thoughts on the movie?
I love this movie. Kind of straight up say that. It does have flaws. It is limited. There is a lot of stock footage, but it's one of those things where I think part of the reason that a lot of people kind of dislike it is that America doesn't really get. A lot of people, I shouldn't say America, a lot of people in America don't get camp. Like they don't understand that tone. Like there hasn't been a real like quote unquote camp American production of anything since the 60s. And this movie, well, I guess, but that's your mileage may vary, right? Where a lot of people went into that, like, it's one of those things where this movie is very much a product of its time. It's very much a product of when it was made and why it was made. But at the same time, it's ridiculous things like the Godzilla tail slide done with complete straight-faced sincerity. Like this is they like, I remember because you guys talked last episode about like some of the compromises that they had to make when they were doing Godzilla versus Gigan. And this movie, it feels like they set out to make a film and they made the film that they wanted to make. Like the stock footage that they added is more just to pad it than to add plot points that were missing. Like it feels like you could still remove most of the stock footage that's in the film and the movie would lose like a certain amount of runtime, but the plot would stay the same. They made the film that they set out to make, and they wanted to make a film that was this, superhero action film about this robot named Jet Jaguar that they wanted to make into like the leaping point of a new franchise. And the fact that like they have a theme song for him that plays throughout the movie, and then we get the version with lyrics at the end. It's like, yeah, this was like, they do this in TV shows now where they have like a disguised pilot where it's like you introduce a new character in the middle of another TV show and be like, hey, this character is going off to do adventures over on the other side of town. Maybe they'll show up on another TV show eventually.
Like the Flash with Arrow.
Yeah, exactly. That's what I was thinking of.
I was thinking Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D.
Yeah.
May Mockingbird rest in peace.
Oh, talk about... I was actually excited for that show.
Yeah. Well, but I feel like this is another, like, that's why like the whole plot of it, even if the story of like them using Godzilla just to boost the marquee value of the film isn't true, it's certainly a perfectly reasonable explanation for why this film is what it is. Yeah. Because Godzilla, like the whole ending fight plays out like a professional wrestling match. Like it starts out with the two people in the ring, and then you have the heel that comes in, Gigan comes in, everybody, it plays his music, and like he comes in and him and Megalon start like just curb stomping Jet Jaguar, and then all of a sudden you hear Godzilla's music and he comes in over the hill, and it's like it's played very specifically for an audience to like stand up and cheer at certain parts and to boo at certain parts. Like it's meant to be what it is. And I can't hate a movie that sets out with a very specific vision and succeeds wholly in what they're trying to do. Camp though it may be, silly though it may be, I still love it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think that's important, right? We've talked about that before, where is it fair to judge art for something it's not trying to do? And it's hard not to do that. I mean, it absolutely is, especially since, you know, you guys are bigger Star Wars fans than I am. I mean, that is one of the things I've had to come to terms with, not only with Rise of Skywalker, but with like Solo, right? Did I go and watch this movie for what it actually is trying to do and trying to be rather than what I wanted from it? Now, one of those I enjoy a lot more than the other. But that being said, I've recognized that my own my own lack of objectivity comes into play there. The same way that when we discussed Gamera Super Monster after watching Rise of Skywalker, I was incredibly harsh on it. Coming to find out now, I've looked into the film more, coming back to it, I enjoyed it a lot more because I'm watching it for what it is, not for what I want it to be.
That was like one of my first too. I mean, we were still pretty early in the show.
Yeah.
By the time I watched that. So
yeah, it was we started in September, and that was December, so we're only a few months in. But yeah, I agree with you. I think for me, the way I described it to someone else is, even though I've been used to going off of the diving board with these movies, I'm not dumb enough to try to do that with this movie because I would break my neck. It's incredibly shallow, but there's nothing wrong with that. There's a reason for a pool to have shallow water, right? And if I try to go to this film expecting more than it's willing to give, I'm going to be incredibly disappointed. But that being said, I mean, it is a fun movie. It is, you know, weird, random boobs porn aside, you know, like there's nothing about this film that I'm not like, man, I wouldn't want to come back to it. Yes, it does take a while to get to the monster action, but I mean, the car chases are fun. You know, the kid inventor. I mean, that to me, that's just so cool. Like he makes his own little motorbike. You know, he gets kidnapped. He gets out of the box truck. The damn explosion's awesome. There's enough to keep you entertained without just the monster fights there at the end. Which, at least for me personally, I can understand why people wouldn't be entertained. But there's some really weird illogical decisions being made, though. Like the whole airplane thing, like that just felt like there's no point to that. That was way overcomplicated. Didn't need to be in there. And then obviously the whole, I'm the villain, I'm going to give the plot, you know, give away what we're doing, even though there's a chance he could escape, right? I mean, it's a plot device, but like, how many times have we seen that?
And like they have him tied up to a chair when there's literally, I mean, going to the Bond villain trope, there's no reason to keep him alive.
No,
like you don't need him.
No,
you only have the inventor and his little brother because you want control of Jet Jaguar. There's no reason to keep this other guy alive at all.
Yeah,
but they can't kill him because it's not that kind of movie.
No, but okay. So I realized this the other night watching it, and I never like dawned on me before. So they're taking the box to the fault line, right? You know, and he wants to dump it in there. So I never realized that the goal was to get him down to Seatopia, apparently, so that they could not only help create Jet Jaguar, but it sounded like the impression I got is they want help creating more robots to protect themselves. So
yeah, how
did they expect him to live being in that giant container crate, just falling and falling and falling? Like, I mean,
they lived through Megalon swatting it up into the air over the top of the hill. So
yeah, that's a good point.
You know, it's got the same like crash resistant foam inside of it that you can't see that the fridge in Kingdom of the Crystal Skull does that Indy rides in.
Well, I just figure maybe, you know, they would have thrown in some purple mattresses in there. You know, they would have been all right. Yeah, so I mean, you know, I'm talking about how illogical the movie is, and I'm getting twisted up over this. Yeah, it's just there's small things I could nitpick, but I mean, it's definitely not my favorite film. There's a lot of nostalgia for me, but I love the soundtrack. I mean, my son is a huge fan of this movie, especially obviously Jet Jaguar. I mean, how can you not be a fan of Evil Ultraman? And then obviously there's an element of the fun I had as a kid watching the Mystery Science Theater 3000 version of this movie as well. One of the few Godzilla films that actually got that treatment.
I think, if I remember correctly, it was only this film and the obviously American version called Godzilla versus the Sea Monster of Ebra that got MST3K'd. So
yeah, they I think Toho got wind of what was actually happening pretty quick. There's more Gamera films on there than Godzilla films. So I think the general consensus is we like the film. It's definitely not like if this was a standalone film, it wouldn't make its way to the Criterion Collection by any means. But there's nothing wrong with that, right?
No.
That's kind of this weird. So it's this weird standard we want to put on movies, right? So I've never shied away from my love of Hot Rod. It's my favorite movie. I don't care what anyone says, but I'm not going to sit here and be like, this is the best movie ever. If no one likes it, you just don't get it. So I think that's kind of the weirdness about this movie, maybe apart from like All Monsters Attack more than anything, is what I've seen is just very, very, very strong opinions and almost somewhat controversial opinions on Godzilla films. So Chris, I know we had kind of talked a little bit the other night, but I kind of wanted to let you take control of the conversation here, because I think you had some good questions and some good thoughts about the matter.
Great. How hard should I come out swinging? That's all right. That's all right. We'll alienate everyone. So here's my question. I'm going to ask the question, maybe unpack it a little bit, and then throw it over to you two to answer it.
Okay.
But so I've seen these movies, the ones that we've covered on the show, and then Godzilla 14. So everything in the meantime, all these animes and Godzukis and whatever the hell else we heard about last week, I don't know about these. It seems like almost like, what are we on? Almost 25?
We've covered, this will be our 23rd movie we've discussed.
Okay. So we've covered like 23 movies, and I think we've had unanimity from the podcast on like 3. Like there's been like, it feels like there's so few that everyone loves. So I feel like every movie I'm learning, every movie I'm like, oh, this one's pretty good. We should probably all like this one. Turns out, no, we don't all like this one. So it's like, I guess my question is kind of like, are we getting to the ones that everyone likes? Do we just like 5 really well, and that translates to the whole franchise? Like, so I guess my question is for you guys, what do you think our experience is? Because from what I've seen, everything's controversial. No movie is actually good. Some people only like it because they grew up watching it. Some people only like it because it was the VHS copy they found in a dumpster behind a Blockbuster. So am I just getting the wrong read? Are we not on the good ones yet? Because I've liked them. I guess there's been a few that I'm like, oh, it's not great, but I don't know. I've rambled, so I'll open that up.
Yeah, if you want to start, Ben. I know, because that's you've talked about, you've been a fan for a while, but obviously not being as active within the fandom. I think your perspective here is really important.
Yeah, it's interesting, kind of coming at it from the point of view, like I mentioned kind of at the top, is that I don't hate any of the Godzilla films. Like I'm one of those rare people who is like, even the ones that I don't like as much, I still enjoy to some degree. But I think a lot of it is just people like to find, like, it's rare for, number one, it's rare for a franchise like Godzilla to exist that's run for as long as it has. Like, there aren't a lot of franchises that have gone for this long. Like, the other ones I can think of off the top of my head are like James Bond and like Doctor Who and things like that have been running forever. But those are also franchises that have very specifically iterated. Like, there's very clear transition points between different eras of that, like, of those franchises where you have different doctors or different people playing Bond. Whereas with Godzilla, you can't break it down that easily, because even the eras that we have, quote unquote, like the Showa era, is incredibly diverse in terms of what films are in that era and the tones they strike and the different types of movies they are. Like, this is, lest we forget, this is the same quote unquote era that brought us the original 2 Godzilla films. The original, like, it is incredibly different in terms of tone. And I think people kind of start to play favorites where they have a specific idea of what Godzilla should be in their head. And they have specific movies throughout the timeline, either in the Showa era or the later eras, that hit that tone, and everything else they kind of disregard, regardless of the quality of it as a film. They have an idea of, like, this is what Godzilla should be, and everything else is bad. It's the same thing with other franchises like that, or like we mentioned with Star Wars or Star Trek or any really long running franchise. You have a lot of people with really strong opinions about what things, quote unquote, should be. without taking the franchise as a whole into account. And I mean, people are entitled to their own opinions. I'm not saying that that's wrong to have a specific part that's a favorite. I just think that disregarding everything else because it doesn't match your own vision is what you're mainly doing is hurting yourself, because you're sacrificing these other films or what have you on kind of the altar of your own vision for a franchise that you have no control over.
Yeah. Well, even if you do that, like it's fine. Just don't enforce that on other people. Right.
Yeah.
You know, with
Don't
like
gatekeep.
yeah. I mean, with the prequels with Star Wars, like, you know, I've gone from loving them as a kid to hating them as an angsty teenager, young adult, being a adult now where I like episodes 1 and 3. 2, I can be fine never watching it again. But I'm not going to, you know, blame anyone for enjoying them or even for not liking them, right? That's the whole point is, you know, you don't have to watch these movies more than you want, but you shouldn't fault anyone for enjoying it either. So I think you're right. I think it is something that, you know, it's especially the Showa era. I mean, as we'll find, Chris, like the Heisei era and the Millennium era, there's more of a consistent tone. So you don't have that, it's that tonal shift. But I think you're right. I think it's just something that we're putting these standards on the franchise that they never intended. And it's easy for us to group them together when really the Showa era is just, this is the period of time that the films were made. That's it. You know, it's not like a continuity or anything.
Yeah. Something I was thinking about, just like when franchises get this long, and it's not like the MCU where you've got like storyline, but I'm even thinking of like, you know, horror franchises used to be like a dozen movies, like Freddy versus Jason 12, when they're like have left hell and now all they have left is like, I don't know, the park down the street to fight at. Where else is there? And you always see these reboot movies, and I think Godzilla, it's far, you know, I'm probably wrong. Probably at least 98 and 14 are soft reboots, I'm thinking. And then Shin, from what I've seen, kind of seems kind of closer to a single monster, but kind of where we're at. Like, if you were to ask me what is Godzilla, these only Godzilla movies are so few of the franchise that we're at right now, that like when other people would talk about what a soft reboot would look like, mine doesn't look like that. So that's kind of where I'm curious too. Like, I'm getting so used to this superhero-y T-posing Godzilla that like to always reset. I try to do a different dance this time so you can stop making fun of me. But like this whole let's get Godzilla back to his roots. It's like, well, his roots kind of feel like these monster fests. There's 4 of them. If you really want to reboot it, put Minya in there, and you got my butt in that seat as long as there's a vaccine.
Well, and I think it's interesting as well that, I mean, not to get into spoilers about films that you guys haven't watched yet, but you can tell that the 2 recent American films, Godzilla 14 and then Godzilla King of the Monsters, were made by 2 different sets of creative teams with 2 different visions of what Godzilla should be. Because they're, you know, like you said, they both have different ideas about where taking Godzilla back to his quote unquote roots is. And like Godzilla 14 has one vision for it. Godzilla King of the Monsters has another and tries to move the 14 version of Godzilla towards that. So it's I don't know if there'll ever be a consensus on things like that. It's just one of those things that it varies and changes from person to person based on their own preferences.
Sure.
Yeah. And I've seen that a lot. So I will speak from my experience, you know, having grown up with the films, especially the Showa era. I think when it came to the Heisei films, I'd only seen Return of Godzilla and Biollante as a kid. And Godzilla vs. Mothra. I saw that one too. But most of them I didn't see as a kid. So growing up, the Showa Godzilla was just what I knew, right? So then coming back into the films again as an adult, you know, I came with this baggage of, well, Godzilla 2014 was serious. You know, these films aren't serious. They're campy. You know, it's just, I'd read online that the Showa films were campy and not serious compared to the original. And I didn't realize it the same way that I allowed other people's opinions of the prequels to influence my views, right? So, it's one of those things where I had to kind of take a step back and be like, wait a minute, wait a minute, wait a minute. Like, there's room for all of these Godzillas at the table, right? There's not just like what you're saying is, there's not just one way to go about this, Chris. And just, if you do a reboot, I mean, really, if you're going to reboot it out of this era, yeah, the Godzilla we see in some of these later films would probably be the more consistent one compared to the original. But it is interesting the way that people just take such a dogmatic opinion of it. And I can say that as someone who used to be that way, right? When I first started coming back in, I was very opinionated about it. I had my butt handed to me a few times, just being like, hey, you're being a dick. And I'm like, ooh, yeah, you're right. But I think it's when you're passionate about something, it's hard not to be that way. So, Chris, I think that's kind of it. Is I think a lot of people, they have these connections with these movies, that it's hard to separate your life experiences and your passions and your feelings from these movies. I mean, again, we see that with Star Wars too. I mean, these are films that people have grown up with. They've not just identified with, but like I can vouch how many times, I associate Star Wars with when my parents were, and same with Godzilla, with when my parents were together and I still had a functional family, right? So like I have those ties there. So I have very deep feelings toward these films. There's other people who feel that way too. So it is hard when you really, it's kind of when you wrap your identity up in art, which can be a very dangerous thing, as we've all learned. But my question, I guess, with the message itself, unless if you have more to say, Chris, I don't want to cut you off.
No, I think those summarized it pretty well. It's just interesting, these differing perspectives, and then building this perspective as an adult rather than as a kid.
Yeah,
or it's a pseudo version of an adult, at least.
I will say one quick caveat to that is I think part of it is when the 90s films came out, this is what I meant to say earlier. When the 90s films came out, they have a more serious tone, as Ben can attest to. So as we've seen with superhero films and everything else, there's a tendency to view serious as better, as realistic, right? As a result, for the longest time, I mean, and you'll see this in marketing too, the Godzilla you see in the 90s is kind of like the de facto Godzilla. You see it in a shirt design, you see it. I mean, even the Criterion set, the Godzilla on the front, is based off the 90s version. But over the past, 5-10 years, there's been a push to reevaluate these 50s, 60s, and 70s films with a different perspective. Now that the films are accessible in the original Japanese. And I think that has helped a lot, understanding like, oh, wait, like these movies weren't intended to be schlock fests, right? They actually had things they were trying to say. The dubbing isn't always the most accurate. What you're saying earlier, Ben, is, these voice actors can't really convey that raw emotion a lot of these actors had. I just listened to the Monsters vs. Men episode on Rodan, and Kenji Sahara, his acting in that is it's so powerful because he's so constrained. Like he's not over the top, and that's what makes it such a good role. But you put that voice actor on top and you lose all of that, So I think that's part of it, Chris, is just the 90s films really kind of took the general, like within the fandom. I mean, it was, oh my gosh, these effects and the score and all this stuff. But people have gone back and been like, wait a minute. Like these older films really do have something they're trying to accomplish, which, the Ishiro Honda biography has helped. There's been numerous books as well. All the G-Fest and stuff. I think it's just a matter of it catching up, and people reevaluating their own opinions too.
Sure.
And then of course you have the people who are like, show era is the best because they think older is better. And yeah, it's just, yeah, you know how it is. Original trilogy over prequel trilogy.
The 90s era Godzilla films are kind of to the Godzilla franchise what the Christopher Nolan Batman films are to the Batman franchise, where they're like this big hit of like codifying movies that are all like, they are consistent. They follow like a very much of a through line of a plot. They all have a consistent tone. They tie directly back to the original film in a way that a lot of the later films, like the one Godzilla versus Megalon, doesn't necessarily. But they've also kind of become franchise defining in a way that causes a lot of other, like, and everything that kind of came up between that to be disregarded for a long time. You know, a lot of people forgot how good, like, for instance, the Tim Burton Batman movie was, or that the 60s show with Adam West was, because they were so obsessed with Nolan's films. And it's like, go back and look at them. They're actually, you know, they have their qualities. They're good in their own ways.
Yep.
There's no reason to disregard them just because you like this version, you know?
Yeah. Same people who are writing off the new Batman because they're like, well, Nolan did it best. And it's like, you can't even allow there to be something new because you're so set on what this trilogy was.
It doesn't help that they keep, like, trying to repeat that success with all the other films that they're making, but you know.
I know. I really wish I could do the Bane voice too. Whatever.
Fans of The Host should like this new Batman because Stephanie Meyer wrote The Host and also wrote Twilight, which set his Robert Pattinson's career, you know, trajectory.
I really hope this isn't your freaking theological insight because you're fired.
No. Hey, you remember that picture of a day challenge that you're doing? The real villain of The Host. I just traced the book cover of the Stephanie Meyer version. Because everybody in that book is a treasure. There's no monster in that movie.
Have you honestly read that book?
Yeah, have I read that book? Yeah. I've read everything she's put out except for the new one.
Oh Lord.
So if anyone ever wants to talk Twilight, hit me up. I'm not even lying. I've read all 6.
HMU, baby.
My DMs.
Speaking of trauma.
Yeah, actually some of those points does tie in really well. Can I introduce the point with my own thought? Thank you. So one of the things that we want to talk about is, like, so this movie is one of the first where we get back to, like, some of the nuclear talk that kind of defines some of the first ones. So in a way, we kind of get back to the roots, so to speak, but it's a markedly different tone in terms of nuclear armament. It's a remarkably different, like, way of handling it. So instead of, like, the nuclear radiation changing ancient monsters, they're just kind of like pissing off some underwater people. So we had talked about, like, rebooting the franchise, these soft reboots. Like, is it, like, the question is, like, is it necessarily appropriate to still go back to the nuclear discussion? Is it being handled well? How did we would it be appropriate for these films to keep having these anti-nuclear messages, or now that we're into the early 70s, should they shift? And maybe when you look at 98 and 14, should they have had the same nuclear messaging or not? Was this one expected to? So now it's my turn to throw it out.
Yeah. Well, because that was kind of my thought is, you know, there's nothing wrong with having those themes, right? Because they do need to be discussed. But there is a certain point where what is, in essence, trauma, national trauma, runs the risk of being commodified, right? And I actually kind of want to open this up to the listeners. We'd love to hear from you because we don't really want to, like, spend another 30 minutes talking about this when really it's something that I've been thinking about, but I don't really have an answer. So, like, I've seen over the past few weeks on Twitter, there's been various Black writers and actors, and just even people in general who have talked about, like, I'm tired of seeing my trauma used as plot devices. I'm tired of seeing about the struggles of the Black community. I'm tired of seeing about how, you know, how successful, you know, or like how good of a story it is when a Black man doesn't go to jail, you know, all these different things. It's like, I'm tired of this, right? I want to see an actual story that celebrates my identity, that doesn't just, in essence, commodify the trauma of the Black experience in America. And I think there's something to be said about that, right? There's a time and a place for those movies. Absolutely. There's a time and a place for those plot points in art. But there's a certain point, too, where it becomes, in essence, it becomes porn, right? We just watch it, we consume it. You know, there's that almost like that sense of satisfaction of, like, you know, I'm watching this and I'm socially aware of these problems, but it doesn't actually do anything because there's no actual real substance there. You know, we go back to, like, Ebra, Horror of the Deep, and it was a great film, but, like, the nuclear messages there were absolutely surface level. There was nothing really except for the fact they were producing bombs on this island. It was a James Bond plot, right? And at the end, It's like, well, if we don't take care of this, this may happen again, kind of thing. And that was it. It was just kind of a pithy little saying. And there wasn't anything there, which is fine for what it is. But again, when people talk about wanting to go back to the roots, like you're saying, Chris, there is a risk of you kind of devalue the meaning when you just try to keep doing the same thing over and over, and there's no actual like heart and substance and reason behind what you're doing apart from just making another movie. And I feel like at this point in time in history, it's very clear Godzilla was a moneymaker, right? It wasn't about the artistic integrity that the original film had, which again was still made to make money, but there's a different sincerity and honesty in that original film that we don't get with the later, and that's fine. But I think to try to like keep going back to that, I don't know. I think there's something disingenuous about that.
Yeah, I think there's a lot to that. I think it's also one of those things where like this because Godzilla vs. Megalon came out in 1973, and obviously that's almost 30 years after the end of World War II.
Mm-hmm.
And I think a lot of the people who like, I don't want to be callous about it, but it's like there's something to be said about distance creating almost like a trauma barrier, mm-hmm. where that's no longer like an open wound. So the treatment of like the way that I guess you could call it an anti-nuclear message in this film is kind of just mentioned at the beginning and the end. It's not really mentioned through most of the film. It's treated almost more like an American film than it is like the way that Godzilla kind of historically treated its anti-nuclear messages, and especially the early films that Honda directed. It's much more like a lot of American science fiction films from the late 50s and early 60s kind of have this idea where, oh yeah, nuclear power is bad. But obviously from the American perspective, well, we have all the nuclear power, so it's not that bad. It's only bad if we lose control of it.
Right.
So that's kind of the same kind of almost the same idea that this film has, where the idea of nuclear power itself isn't treated as a bad thing. It's only that it was being used improperly. Like mm-hmm. the problem that the protagonists have with it is the way that it's being used as for these underground tests that are causing all of these problems. It's like, it's almost like things have moved to a different place in, I don't even want to say the culture, because I don't know, this might just be like Sekizawa's point of view and the point of view of a few other people who were working on this film. And maybe they didn't think about it that much, but again, things had progressed to the point, 20 some, almost 30 years on, where that just wasn't like, it wasn't the hot button topic anymore mm-hmm. for them. And that's even, it's like, I'm trying to think of what like a Western comparison would be. And the nearest thing I can think of is what if somebody, what if somebody like 30 years after 9/11 did something similar with a film where they talk about the idea of flying a terrorist flying a plane into a building as bad, more because it's a misuse of the plane than because of the people dying in the as a result of the accident. And I don't know. It's I can't really like pass a judgment on it because I don't really understand the Japanese culture of the era well enough to kind of make a statement to why they may have pushed that aside. But I think you're right. The idea of commodifying trauma and being like, oh, this is something that we have in the past, or is something that everybody's going to understand, from like, we don't even have to go into a lot of details about like, oh, these are nuclear bombs that are being exploded underground and that's bad. It's just kind of understood that the audience would know that that's bad. So mm-hmm. when tragedy is kind of used as a shorthand for your plot, that's when you start having issues, and it's almost like a writing shortcut, and that's not a great look, honestly. Yeah.
See, and I was thinking about that. You're mentioning, maybe it just wasn't a hot button topic, but as we talked about in our Hedera episode, you have the Prophecies of Nostradamus, which comes out in 1974, which, Yoshimitsu Banno, who wrote and produced or directed Hedera, he was one of the writers on that film, and that does deal with, just the dangers of nuclear warfare, the global nuclear conflict and the arms race and everything. So like, I think you're right. I think there is that distance there where it's not as, I'm not going to say impactful, right? Because this is where we could really get into some anachronisms, but it's the same way where, I mean, if you think about it, like when 9/11 happened, obviously it was a very traumatic moment, but as we've moved on, you still have people like my grandma who will share a 9/11 meme on May 5th. But for the most part, we don't think about it, right? It's just become part of our society where, the way that we go to the airport and all this stuff, the Patriot Act, all these things, like it's just kind of, we're so used to it that we don't think about what that event caused.
Mhm.
So, there is something there. And even Miroslav Volf, I was promising myself I'd reference him in this episode. He talks about that in his End of Memory, where, when it comes to trauma, there's a responsibility of remembering rightly and responsibly. And I only bring that up because when it comes to these elements, it's very easy for us to think, well, I don't think about it very often, therefore it isn't prevalent. But yeah, we're not scholars of Japanese culture in the 70s, so we don't really know what the mood was here. But I think there is a responsibility as a artist that if you are going to handle these topics, you handle it responsibly. And you're right, it just did feel kind of like oh, well, these are bad because if we keep doing this, we're going to get hurt. It wasn't really the implication of what is this what's the implication of doing these bombs doing to our world, right? It was just kind of oh, well, we're going to get killed kind of mentality to it. So I think that is something to at least address, but it's hard to moralize the directors and writers' decisions here. That's the last thing we want to do.
Mhm.
You got anything, Chris, or are you ready to lay on the preaching?
Gosh. This one was a little tougher to make a theological point. Obviously you've got the people who live under the water, which is what we've talked about. The symbolic world of the ancient Near East is that God's enemy lived in the water.
Mm-hmm.
But this time they're kind of the heroes, and they come out of the water to challenge the monsters. So it's like a reverse of Daniel here. So it's kind of tough. But you could kind of say that evil Ultraman was like a robotic Adam, having dominion over the animals to kind of tame the sea again. But it's so like upside down and backwards. It was hard to say too much. So I'm happy to say that evil Ultraman was a robotic Adam, and hopefully when we see him again, his Adamic influence will just rise out of that. But man, if it's not an indication of what this film had or did not have to say, that I struggled with this, I don't know what's a more damning indictment.
Yeah,
honestly.
I think you are allowed to pass for the past few gold mines that you've produced.
Man, I got to start writing these somewhere.
Yeah. So I wanted to again open up. We want to hear from you about that topic, right? Just kind of this is it, because here's the thing. Obviously, we have a Godzilla movie that's supposed to be coming out within the next year, right? It'll be interesting to see how they tackle those themes. So we want to hear from you. I mean, is it the right thing to do to keep coming back to those themes? Should we take the approach of Ishiro Honda, where he desired to see more creativity in what Godzilla stood for? Do we start seeing in these films a commodification of trauma, like you brought up? We want to hear from you because we want to have that conversation. So you can email us, DM us, whatever the case is. But there was a quote I wanted to read before we close from Stanley Hauerwas, who is a theologian and ethicist. So he's talking here about marriage, but I want to invite you all to think about this in the context of these films. So we never know whom we marry. We just think we do. Or even if we first marry the right person, just give it a while and he or she will change. For marriage being the enormous thing it is, means we are not the same person after we have entered it. The primary challenge of marriage is learning how to love and care for the stranger to whom you find yourself married. So I brought that up because it's just one of those things where as we see Godzilla continually changing throughout the films, it is somewhat of a challenge to keep remembering, is this the same series, so to speak, and how do you kind of develop and adjust those feelings and not, again, try to put standards on these movies that they didn't ask for, right? So before we close here and give Ben a chance to plug himself a little bit, I wanted to share a review left from one of our listeners, Kaiju Kim. So her review was, I recently started listening to a few Kaiju podcasts, and if I had to pick my favorite, it would be this one. David and Chris really make me think of the films I grew up with in a different way, and it's just fantastic. Keep up the good work. So thank you, Kaiju Kim, for that. If you do leave a Apple or Stitcher review, which we have none on Stitcher, I didn't even know you could leave that until a couple days ago.
I just learned that right this second. That was today years old.
So we will definitely read that on the air. As we've explained before, it does help with just, accessibility and people finding us. But at the end of the day, it is what it is. That's not why we're doing it. But we do appreciate the reviews all the same. Ben, we do appreciate you coming on, but if you wouldn't mind, take a few minutes, plug yourself. I know you do some writing, but you also edit a podcast. So why don't you talk about that and just anything else that we should know about you?
Yeah. So if you want to kind of check in on my writing stuff, like how Chris and I originally met, you can go over to 1138.com. It's all Star Wars based. So if you're a Star Wars fan, you can head over there. Speaking of Star Wars as well, I also am the editor for a podcast called the Imperial Senate Podcast. I am not on it, but I do edit it. If you want to check that out, you can. It is much more. It's very different from this podcast, is what I'll say. But that's as much as I'll say. And then, if you want more of my writing personally, I do have a personal blog that only right now has a couple of short stories on it. There's not a whole lot there, and it's been very sparsely updated. It's just the web address for it. Let me make sure I got this right here. It's just gears, nails, and chewinggum.com. I created that domain probably 6 years ago now, and I still don't know why I made it what it is.
Just keep renewing it.
Yeah, basically. And I don't put much up there except for some random short stories that I have. I have a Twitter, but I don't have any posts on it right now. I'm currently taking a hiatus from Twitter. But you can still hit me up there if you want. Give me a follow. I might be able to follow back, and then we can, share DMs or whatever the case might be. But yeah, I mainly focus on writing more than podcasting personally. So
yeah, I'll make sure to plug all of that in our notes there. But yeah, we really do appreciate you on. That was kind of one of the things Chris and I talked about, is trying to get, some more diverse voices instead of having the same podcast hosts on every single show. Because at a certain point, you're like, I've already heard you before. So it's good to have, it's a good reminder that just because we don't see certain names pop up as often in Twitter discourse, it doesn't mean that they're not watching and interacting with the conversations. Because I do remember your live tweets when you're going through the Criterion set, and that was a blast. I had fun reading those. All right, Chris. So actually, wait, crap. I have to close. Sorry. Didn't mean to tease you there. Okay. Thank you again, everyone, for tuning in to the Kaiju Apostle podcast. If you like what you heard, or you have a comment you'd like to share, make sure to let us know over at our Twitter page. Our handle is Kaiju Apostle Pod, or you can send us an email at contact@thekaijuapostle.com. You can also follow Chris on Twitter at Chris Worms, and that is WERMS. And are you still taking a Sentai break?
I'm taking like an everything break.
Good on you.
No, not on purpose. I would love to watch something. Gosh. No, Ultimate Z's been really good. So watch that if you have. Well, it's too late if you haven't. No, there's one that everyone's talking about that's going up. I'm going to pull it up real quick because I have it right at my fingertips. It's going up. It's another Toku show. Denko Chojin Gridman is going up on the Tsuburaya YouTube page. So I've heard a lot about that. So
is that the original Gridman?
I couldn't tell you. I could barely tell you that about the ones I like and know well. So I don't know. It's going up on the Tsuburaya YouTube page, and it's probably going to have English subs. So I'll check that out.
Okay. Yeah, I remember hearing about SSSS.Gridman, but I think it's a little too fan servicey for me personally. But I've heard some really good stuff about that. So, but until next time.
Ooh. May Mothra watch over you, Godzilla power you, and High Priest Moist Minya bring you joy.
Okay, I am going to redo the first part of that that intro really quick. Thank you again, everyone, for tuning in to the Kaiju Apostle podcast. If you like what you heard or you have a comment you'd like to share, make sure to let us know over at our Twitter page. Our handle is Kaiju Apostle Pod. Okay, yeah, that was super lame. I'm not leaving that in. I was like, I can't come up with anything there anymore. It's bumming me out. Like usually it's just like,
look, having riff written in parentheses on a script is really like, that's a pressure situation, man.
No, I know, but that's the problem is I'd start doing that, so I'm gonna like remove it.
Just leave it blank.
I think that's actually you said what I was thinking. So